Hello, friends. Today I want to share some facts about salt intake and why low salt intake can shorten our lives. We are all guided by the World Health Organization recommendations that call for consuming no more than 2 grams of sodium daily. It is 5 grams of regular table salt. Physicians all over the civilized world work according to these recommendations. I live by these recommendations, and throughout my conscious life, I tried to limit salt consumption in my diet to the point that I had no salt in the kitchen in general. It has been believed for a long time that the salt that a person consumes with ordinary food is enough. It means bread, potatoes, cereals, and meat. That is, what we eat daily. Why did this attitude to salt appear? The fact is that high salt consumption is associated with an increase in blood pressure. It is actually a long-established fact since salt, or rather the sodium it contains, contributes to fluid retention in the body, increased release of adrenaline and noradrenaline, and increased sensitivity of blood vessels to adrenaline and noradrenaline. It increases the volume of circulating fluid and narrows the vessels. All this together leads to an increase in blood pressure. Therefore, people with hypertension have always been advised to reduce salt intake. The recommendations of the World Health Organization also apply to healthy people. They advise trying to consume as little salt as possible, 5 grams of table salt per day or 2 grams of sodium. The logic is that if we eat less salt, it will lead to the fact that the pressure will not rise, the risks of hypertension will disappear, and, accordingly, the risk of cardiovascular diseases will disappear. Consequently, reducing salt intake will prolong our lives, as cardiovascular diseases are the #1 cause of death worldwide. This view has been common until recently. However, some people have begun to ask why people in Japan consume large amounts of salt, much more than people in the United States. At the same time, life expectancy in Japan is longer, and the incidence of cardiovascular disease is lower than in the United States. There is some information gap. While the association between salt intake and hypertension has been proven, the association between salt intake and cardiovascular mortality is purely speculative. However, we know that everything must be tested in evidence-based medicine in randomized clinical trials, or at least large-scale epidemiological observational studies. A few years ago, an attempt was made to follow many people and link salt intake to the development of hypertension and the risk of cardiovascular disease. This study involved about 250,000 people from 27 countries. In 2018, interim data were published in the journal Lancet. They were so contradictory that they caused a flurry of criticism from many prominent cardiology associations. Nevertheless, a fact is a fact. The published data concerned people from 35 to 75 years old, absolutely healthy, that is, without cardiac diseases, hypertension, diabetes, kidney disease, and so on. Just healthy people. Salt intake and the development of cardiovascular disease were observed. The mechanism of the study was as follows. An average urine sample was collected from people once a day, and a specific formula was used to calculate the amount of sodium they excrete during the day, because the amount of sodium excreted in urine reflects very well the amount of sodium a person consumes in food. The researchers divided people into 3 groups. In the first group, the average salt intake was 10.1 grams per day. In the second group, the daily average salt intake was 11.75 grams, and in the third group, the amount of salt consumed was 14.38 grams. The first group with the lowest salt intake had a higher number of fatal cardiovascular events, and the incidence of cardiovascular disease was also higher. In the second group with moderate salt intake, there was no association between salt intake and the incidence of cardiovascular disease in general. Finally, in the third group, there was a slight increase in the incidence of cardiovascular disease. If we draw a graph of the correlation between the incidence of cardiovascular disease and the amount of salt consumed, the diagram is in the form of the English letter J. In other words, low salt consumption led to increased mortality. Average salt consumption caused the lowest mortality, and high salt consumption slightly increased the number of cardiovascular diseases, so much so that this figure can be neglected. In these studies, all the people consumed salt in quantities much higher than the World Health Organization's recommended intake. Even in the group with the lowest salt intake, people consumed 10.7 grams per day, and as we recall, 5 grams daily is the recommended dose that the World Health Organization guidelines suggest we should aim for. Let me remind you once again that these studies involve people with normal blood pressure and healthy people. Many people refused to take the data from this study seriously and criticized it. However, the study was indeed conducted in 27 countries on many people. Different regions and different populations of people with various dietary habits were involved. The same results were obtained everywhere. Since there was a criticism of this work, the magazine High Fashion in April 2019 published another work, which also aimed to identify the correlation between salt intake and the incidence of cardiovascular disease and increased blood pressure. In this study, people were observed for 7 years. The number of subjects was 457,000 people, the average age of which was 56 years. These were also healthy people without heart attacks, hypertension, diabetes mellitus, and other diseases. Curiously, this study found no correlation between salt intake and the incidence of cardiovascular disease and mortality from it. Somehow, the results of this study also disproved our beliefs that high salt intake always poses cardiovascular risks. What mechanism can explain that decreased salt intake causes an increased incidence of cardiovascular disease and even leads to higher mortality? It is believed that a decrease in blood sodium concentration causes activation of the renal juxtaglomerular apparatus. The juxtaglomerular apparatus of the kidneys are cells that produce renin. Renin is the enzyme that acts on angiotensinogen. Angiotensinogen is a protein that is produced in the liver. It circulates in the blood in an inactive form. As soon as we activate renin, it converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is then converted to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin-converting enzyme tensin is involved in converting angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. The converting enzyme is located in the pulmonary vessels. Under the action of angiotensin-converting enzyme, the concentration of angiotensin 2 increases, and angiotensin 2 already affects the adrenal glands. Angiotensin 2 increases the production of aldosterone. That is, the so-called renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is triggered. Our organism functions in such a way that activation of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system leads to changes in vessel walls, the formation of atherosclerotic plaques, changes in the shape of the heart, disruption of heart relaxation, an increase in vascular tone, a decrease in insulin sensitivity, to accelerated activation of chronic inflammation processes, to destabilization of atherosclerotic plaques, which are already, for example, formed in coronary arteries. Activation of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system significantly increases health risks. For this reason, reducing salt intake can lead to adverse cardiovascular outcomes and deaths by paradoxically activating the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. This change in the perception of the role of salt intake in the development of cardiovascular disease and life risks, in general, has resulted from a recent study. Of course, this research is ongoing, and we will see what fruit it will bear in the future. What conclusions can be made based on this information? I think eating 1 teaspoon of salt a day is generally not harmful. That is, there is no point in avoiding salt altogether, and there is no point in eating unlimited amounts of it. Always there for you, Dr. PopMed.